From Sugar 23, I am Angela Ledgerwood, and this is Lit Up. I have been waiting to speak to our guest this week for over 2 years. Her name is Abi Morgan, and she is the playwright and BAFTA and Emmy award-winning screenwriter, best known for Brick Lane, Iron Lady, Shame, The Invisible Woman and Suffragette. Now, most recently, she's also created the hit series The Split. We are not here to talk about her incredible film and TV career, although we'll touch upon it, don't worry. In 2018, Abi's partner of 18 years and father to their 2 children, Jacob, collapsed on the bathroom floor after experiencing a series of seizures, and he was put into a medically induced coma for 7 months. When he woke up, he recognized everyone in their life, his children, his family and friends, but he believed Abi wasn't who she says she was and that she was an imposter, possibly working for the state. Now, Abi has written a remarkable memoir called This Is Not a Pity Memoir, and it's all about what happens when the person you love most no longer recognizes you. Abi and I talk about this extraordinary and traumatic, but also absurdly funny, sometimes in moments, experience she had, the glimmers of joy that got her through, and ultimately why writing this remarkable book helped her keep hold of her own sanity. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I've been lucky enough to have read your book a couple of years ago now, so it's so incredible to see it resonating with people, and it will finally land in the US. Abi, firstly, how are you?
I'm good. It's great. We've just had our Jubilee weekend, so we've all got very patriotic. We've had a lot of, strawberries and cream and Union Jack. It feels like very much after the party, so it's very nice to be talking to you.
Oh, great. Yeah, from across the pond. So we're talking about your memoir, This Is Not a Pity Memoir. Why not dive into why choose this title?
So the first time that I met my partner, Jacob, we were met at a dinner party and we were talking about books we love, and I was tentatively talking about becoming a writer, and that I was chasing a memoir of someone I really admired and a memoir which I loved, which was called Before I Say Goodbye by Ruth Picardy, which was the writings and emails and thoughts of Ruth, who was a journalist and unfortunately was dying of cancer. And it's this very beautiful, often very funny, very profound take on what it means to be facing your death. And I happened to tell Jacob all about this book and he'd read it, but sitting next to him was a very drunk girl who was very rude and very sloppy, and basically went, "Oh, I can't stand those pity memoirs." And so when my own life kind of suddenly had a quality of this memoir, and there kind of was an intense and I hope a profound experience, I just felt like, oh, actually, this is a really interesting title. So the book is really a rumination on what a memoir is and why I'm writing this story.
Well, and I wanted to touch upon that because what do you usually look for in a story when you decide to take on something to write about professionally? Is there some type of ping for you to go, I'm going to explore this?
Yeah, I think ping's a really good word. I call it the dog whistle. So it's that thing that makes you prick up your ears, but that not anyone else can hear. It's the thing that's, inaudible to the rest of us. And I guess I'm always looking for that in a story. I'm looking, when I go and meet someone extraordinary and I think, yeah, they've clearly gotten their extraordinary life, but what is it? And they may say one thing and I go, oh, I've got it. It's really about someone, who loses a son, but is battling their own madness, or it's really about, a woman who became absolutely the helm of power in Britain, but really it's about a woman who was fighting her class as much as gender. And so I just try and look for this thing, and often that can come out of research. Sometimes that can come out of directly meeting someone. Sometimes there's a world that I want to enter. I'm looking for the reason why I want to tell it and what I feel I can hear that maybe no one else can hear at that moment, and what I want to try and convey and find from that story that maybe I don't feel I've seen before.
Well, we'll come to exactly what your story is about and when that moment happened for you within your own life. I guess, could we start with that normal day, the before?
Yeah, I mean, the memoir opens on what is a very typical morning in my life. It was a hot June morning. I'm a mother and I'm a partner to Jacob. We've been together 18 years. He was an actor. We had two teenage children. Jacob has an underlying condition of multiple sclerosis, but he's very high functioning. He'd been shooting a film that week, and he just had woken up with a terrible headache. As he describes, "You're a terrible nurse," and I truly am a terrible nurse. I'd thrown paracetamol at him, and I'd kind of promised to come back with something slightly stronger to help him in the afternoon. But I was focused on myself and getting my coffee, and it was the last day of my son's GCSEs. And so as I headed out, I was focused on him, but I was also slightly battling this familiarity, this kind of ennui around Jake's illness that I kind of thought came and went, this sort of low level fatigue and headaches that Jacob had experienced for quite a long time. And when I came back at lunchtime, everything changed. I found Jacob collapsed on the bathroom floor, and it became very apparent that something was very seriously wrong. And Jake was blue lit to hospital, and we realised that Jake had experienced a tonic-clonic seizure, which was as extreme kind of grand mal seizure. And so ensued 2 weeks where doctors, consultants tried to work out what was wrong with Jacob as he cognitively, psychiatrically, physically declined, to the point that Jacob was then, in order to save his life, put in an induced coma for 7 months. And during that 7 months, it became clear that Jacob was suffering from anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, better known as brain on fire, and that actually it was going to take some time to work out how to heal him and get him better. And so we had a very life and death 6-7 months, but we were very fortunate. And so the book really opens on that first day and starts to capture what then ensued, kind of a catastrophic grenade in our entire life, upending of the narrative of our life as Jacob kind of went through his own recovery and kind of woke up from this coma. And I guess the book is also seen through the prism of my eyes as a screenwriter. Someone said to me when he was in a coma, "Gosh, can you imagine if he wakes up and doesn't know you anymore?" And I had dismissed it as a kind of theatrical filmic trope, not believing it could happen. But in fact, the very thing that we least expected happened. So when Jacob woke up, he woke up with a very rare delusion known as Capgras delusion, which is the belief in imposters. And it can often be focused on someone they're close to. Sometimes it can be focused on an object or a dog or a house. But in this case, it was focused on me. And so Jacob, when he woke up, it quickly became apparent that he didn't know who I was anymore.
There is a line that keeps coming back to me, and it's when he says to you, "Why do you have such an interest in my children?" And you're obviously there with him, and they're your children together. But these moments that would happen, how did you cope? You said in the book too that there was almost a shaking would come upon you when you first had this realization that he didn't recognize you. Was it a numbing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an overload of sensory experiences. It's shock, it's disbelief, it's comedy. We've seen these moments in films. I'd been with Jacob for 18 years. I'd done a drama degree where you had to play those silly games where you had to try and wake up a sleeping lion. I just couldn't believe it was happening. But one of the strongest sensations I had, certainly in the first 2-3 days, was I kept on asking people if they could feel the underground, the subway. I just kept on thinking the ground is shaking under my feet, and I could feel like it. I can only describe it as kind of energy. I now think it was just a massive overload of adrenaline. And so I think initially I was just in shock, and then you barter with yourself. You tell yourself it can't be true. You ask other people and they can't believe it. And, at first it was very mercurial. It was very difficult to clearly see, was it me that Jake didn't know anymore? Could it be me? Was it anyone else? But it was distilled around Valentine's Day, 3 weeks or so after he'd woken up, 2-3 weeks, where I took in a cheesy red cellophane balloon, I tied it to the end of his bed, kind of went da-da, thinking he'd find it funny. And in fact, I could see embarrassment on his face. And I remember feeling this incredible relief that I hadn't written him a card. And then when the nurse tried to get him to give me a rose, which she'd very kindly, the nurses had bought roses for all the patient's family, and said, give the rose to your wife. And he said, "She's not my wife." And in that moment, that was when I definitively knew he didn't know who I was anymore. And so the only way I can describe it is, you just, having done the kind of backflip of 6-7 months of not knowing if Jacob would live, and then the kind of unbelievable relief that though he was clearly very changed and was going to need a lot of help and a lot of therapy and a lot of work to get better, he seemed to recognize us, and you could see flickers of Jacob in there. For him not to know me, it was bizarre and peculiar. You reference him talking about our children. There's one day, which I describe in the book, where I slowly and quickly found ways to develop and communicate with Jacob. And one of the things he initiated was this idea that I must have been hired by the state to look after him and his children. And I didn't specifically agree to it. I just sort of let it happen. And it became a way for him, I think, to manage to have me in the room. We had one day where we were talking about our children, his children, and we started to talk about Mabel, and who's my daughter, who then was 14. And we got into the conversation of the morning she had been born, and we kind of riffed on the memory of this. It's a very happy memory for me. It was a very sort of gorgeous things about her birth that really resonated specifically. I described it and he described it a little back, and we kind of had a moment of communion where we talked about it. And I said, it was an amazing day. He went, yeah, no, it was an amazing day. I wish you'd been there. And in that moment, I realized that was also the perversity, was that I could even show that I knew things. I could share stories with him, but he couldn't quite correlate that I'd been in that narrative of his life. I'd been in that story. I guess in so many ways as a screenwriter, my job is to create and embellish and build character. And suddenly my character was wiped out. Suddenly I had been like written out, rubbed out. I describe it as being rubbed out. And that's the best way to describe it. It was like there was some damage within his brain where that kind of shape of me had been rubbed out. So I think, one of the things that was interesting was that it wasn't that Jake didn't believe that I existed. He referred to Abi Morgan, his wife, his partner. It was always the ongoing, because at that point we weren't married. But actually, it was his belief that she'd gone away and the person that was facing him was an imposter. So it was a very peculiar time. But I am a dramatist. So also I was intrigued, and I would be lying if I said I wasn't sort of like, this is extraordinary. I was aware how weirdly extraordinary it was. I think every writer has a moment where they go, wow, what am I going to write next? And it wasn't that I specifically thought I would write this up, but I did have that same kind of fizz that I sometimes get when I think this is an interesting story. I thought, God, this is interesting. This has gone into another realm here.
Was it only after Jacob didn't recognize you that you started to write?
No, I started the day Jacob collapsed. I couldn't sleep that first night, so I just sat up in bed with my laptop and I started to type away. And so certainly the first 100 pages of the book, I drew very heavily on a diary I kept. And I think there's an intensity and a momentum to those first half of the book, which I think kind of marries as well with how adrenalized those first few months are, because one of the things that no one tells you, and certainly films hadn't shown me, was how active comas are. Comas aren't this kind of solitary person lying in a bed with a crisp sheet over them and silence with the odd peep and the odd crossing of a nurse, or, someone sitting holding their hand. It's physical. It's therapists coming in to move someone's body. It's constant influx of consultants putting on wires so that they can measure brain waves. It's medication, it's blood pressure, it's the drawing of fluids, it's blood transfusions, it's plasma exchanges, it's visitors, it's music, it's deep grief on a ward when you realise someone hasn't survived, it's moments of great joy when you realise someone is going to live and they're going to go to rehab. It's this incredible, intense, meaningful place, actually, and which we stayed in for 7 months, and went into as a family, I went in virtually every day for 7 months. So it becomes a kind of fascinating ecosystem as well. And I guess I started to note down and watch and write and communicate. That was the big thing. I was very lucky because Jacob's family were brilliant, and so were mine. My family were brilliant, and my children were absolutely there as running partners, but we would always communicate. We'd be writing all the time, we'd be calling, we'd be leaving voice messages. And so this huge sort of paper trail of research started to build as well alongside this. So I kind of started to see this story literally unfolding in front of me, as well as mentally, because I was struggling every day to understand what was happening. And I write to think. I speak often to think and I write to think. And so writing it all down, I found a way to process at the end of every day. I would just write down what had happened, and I would make notes, and I would write down often my feelings and my reactions to things. And I think it's what kept me sane.
Well, I was just thinking about that. You said you write to make sense of the world, but you also wrote, I think, from my point of view, when I read it, to place yourself in the world through your own experience, because he's kind of obliterated you from his point of view. And I think when you love someone and build a life with them, you see yourself through their eyes, through those interactions. Were there times that you felt your sanity slipping too, and you had ways to ground and bring you back?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write about all of them. There are certain things I preserved because they were so private and they were so intense, where we had to, it looked like Jake may not survive. I kept those as sort of those tiny little squares. But I think anything to do with myself, often when it was me, when it was to do with something that was directly affecting me and that I could separate them from a little more, I would go in brutally and hard on that. And writing became an act of resistance to me. What I came to see, certainly when Jacob started to come home, was that it's not that he forgot me, he'd forgotten himself, and it was himself who's obliterated. And one of the things that I found at a very key moment, actually, in terms of the storytelling, was that Jacob's voice started to come to me. I started to hear the Jacob that I knew before this, because he was very silent. I started to hear it in my head, so I started to write as if I was communicating to him. And I kept on thinking I must tell him the story of what's happening to himself. So it was a very kind of quite an existential experience. The idea of grief-stricken weirdos who throw themselves on the coffin because they're so attached, you're so connected, you can't bear to be separated. I didn't realize how interwoven my life was. My mortgages, my finances, my shared history, my memories were dependent and reliant on him for the last 18 years. And when I was ejected from his life, I was also ejected from those memories. And so the writing also became a way for me to start to write down the story of us. So I write about how Jacob and I first met. I write about our early years together. I write about the fights. I write about the joys. I write about the nuances of our relationship, because I was trying to understand who we had been, who we were. Did we exist? I was trying to write myself and us back into existence. And although the writing is written in a very kind of, automatic kind of flowing way, it's also, there's a huge amount of control in there, because I'm writing through the prism of a screenwriter. I'm writing to know when the plot twists happen, and I'm writing to know when there are the moments of tragedy. I'm trying to capture the moments of humour. And that was going on all the time. It's the way I see the world. It's the way I filter experience. So the book, in a way, is me also filtering, but also recognising and creating the story of it as it was happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's also an absurdity that you capture. I think we get such a sense of the family dynamic. Like, this was a happy family.
Yeah, but I also talk about the fights. I talk about the therapy. One of the things that was so interesting and has been so interesting is that you realize how you pack away parts of yourself in a relationship. You compromise, you accommodate one another. It really made me have to go, okay, which bits do I want to take? Which bits do I like? Where did I like that? Did I physically like the sofa there? Do I want that picture there? I kind of recolonized my life at the same time as, bringing Jacob home. It's become a extraordinary reset. And invariably there is the absurd that comes out of that. The book is full of the absurd moments. Realizing that you've inadvertently been written out of the birth of your own child in itself is absurd. Or, the kind of the conversations, the games that I would play with Jacob, where I would say, Jake, quiz me today, ask me questions about yourself. And I would get every answer right, every football team, every funny moment, every birthday event that had happened, I'd get everyone right. And internally I'd be like, punching the air going, he must believe it's me now. But he would look at me with the suspicion of a magician who'd nicked his watch, who'd kind of somehow was wearing his watch, and he'd be thinking, how did you do that? He didn't think, oh, of course, hallelujah, she's back. So that in itself became incredibly motivating and at times very frustrating. And I tried to squeeze the joy out of life, because I had a lot of joy around me. I had a very supportive family, both Jake and mine, but I also had 2 teenagers. And teenagers have their own dramas. Teenagers need a life. Walls needed to be painted. Microwaves needed to be replaced because they blew up as a result of a melted down bag of popcorn. Your life goes on. Life goes on. And I tried to use the metronome of that life to give meaning. And what I came to realize is the making of popcorn with your kids is the meaning of life. The birthday, the sharing of cake with your family is the meaning of life. It's not the winning of awards. And if it is, it's the sharing with the people you love.
You touched upon that community that was around you, the friends and family, the doctors and nurses, but also, I think, friends. I'd love to talk about some of those friendships that got you through, those women that know your sense of humor. They knew when they could make a joke to break, just help you, or when they knew it was time. Because even in the first scenes, you call your best friend.
Yeah, I mean, the friends I lent into, one of my closest friends, my best friend, had just herself gone through cancer, was just finishing up her treatment as I was going into it. And that was really complex and painful and brilliant because I had someone who completely shared it, but in many ways I felt this huge guilt because she'd supported me through everything with Jacob, and that was while she had cancer and now I had cancer. So there was a kind of hierarchy of grief going on in that. But she was brilliant and tremendous and helpful, and it really helped that her daughter and my daughter were best friends. There were the neighbours that I talk about. She left me a jar of honey every Sunday on my front doorstep, or some eggs, or my sister, who I'm very close to, who I work with. Yes, she's family, but she's also one of my closest friends. She was my first reader of the book. There was my dog. Who knew that there was so much love and certainty and reassurance in the warmth of a dog every night, who would lie by your side and wake up when the foxes were scratching outside in the garden. And then I guess there was my female oncologist. I like 3-4 months into Jake's recovery, and obviously I write about this, when I developed cancer and I discovered that I had this pain in my chest, which was stage 3, grade 3 cancer. That in itself I was reeling again, and mainly because I had to convince my kids that they could believe in the world and they could trust in one solid parent, that I was going to stay solid. And then when that happened, I really had to dig deep. But my female oncologist was just off the chart. She was so thoughtful, so kind. And I just felt this huge sense she got it. She got that I was needed. She got that she was going to do everything she can. She was going to tweak that medication. She was going to make the anti-sickness meds work for me. And I've worked with the same female colleagues for the last 15, 20 years. So they were amazing. I lent into them. So I guess I found magic and hope and friendship.
I mean, your greater career is so extraordinary, but the split that's, I think, in its 3rd season, that's so fabulous. At what point were you writing in the writer's room for that? Although you are the writer's room, aren't you?
So I was working on the 2nd series of The Split. I was just writing the 2nd series when Jacob collapsed, and then we were just shooting it when I got breast cancer. So that was I started to write it in the autumn, early spring of 2018, and we shot that in 2018, the summer of 2018. And the way that worked when Jacob was in hospital was that the offices where Sister Pictures, which is the production company I work with on that show, it was about a 10-minute walk between the hospital and their offices, and they were amazing. So I would go into a script meeting and they were there when I took the most awful calls, the calls that they would say, you need to come in now, he may not make it. And they were there when I was so tired, I'd been up all night, or I was going through chemo. They were there and they'd let me lie down on the sofa and they'd feed me Haribo's and they'd say, we'll come back in an hour and we'll start up again. So they really lived through the experience, as did the actors. And then when Jacob came out of rehab, and then we kind of went through the recovery period, so 2019 into 2020, that's when I started to build and shape the new series. And in fact, 2021 was really at the peak when Jake was right in the middle of his recovery at home, and I'd written series 3 in the last series. And in fact, it took me a long time to see it, but it was only when I watched the last series I realised how much of what I'd gone through I'd poured into those characters. It's a show about a group of family lawyers, female family lawyers, siblings who all work together, a mother and 2 daughters, and then a 3rd sister who is kind of the younger sister who's the joy in it. It's about their lives and their loves and their losses and their breakups, and ultimately it's about the character of Hannah Defoe, who's this family lawyer. And I always designed it as 3 series, 3 seasons, you'd call it, because I wanted to look about the legacy of divorce. So it opens on our central character in series 1 looking at the divorce of her own parents, and then through series 2 embarking on her own affair, and then having to face her own divorce in series 3. And series 3 is about loss. It's about families having to reconcile and recover and regroup when a marriage is obliterated and an ecosystem falls apart. And I can see so many parallels with what I was going through, and I can hear so much resonance in the dialogue of those characters.
Also, your relationship with Jacob, he was an incredible partner. The way you structured your lives together as parents, you could go off and work. So I thought it was so interesting to be a woman and to think, how do we do this? Doing it all is impossible. It's just ridiculous, an idea. How do you negotiate? How do you build a career and a life and a family? And I think here in this book, it's certainly that's not what it's the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about it, but it is an incredible example of a partnership.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what this experience would have been like if it had happened at the start of our relationship and not 18 years in. Because, it was 18 years of evolving and shaping and fighting and resolving and coming to terms with the way our family worked. In many ways, we used to laugh and say it was quite a 1950s marriage, and quite a role reversal. But it didn't just happen. We evolved to that. Jacob was an actor, and there's always that moment with acting, which is feast and famine. You have those periods when you do and don't work. I guess I had a certain passion. I had a career. And so it very naturally evolved that Jacob was the stay-at-home dad. And, that phrase, can you have it all? You can have it all if there's another person in the room willing to help you. So I had a huge amount of support from him, and he really ran our lives. And when he did collapse and when he did go through it, I really had to examine how much I had delegated to him. And whilst that gave me an absolute clear rein to write, and it was amazing. I could work late. I did work late. When I sat down with my children quite recently and I asked them what were their 5 favourite days, they described their 5 favourite days, but the reality was I wasn't in one of them. Oh, there was that amazing day when we went to San Francisco and we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge and I was in LA working. Or there was that amazing trip when we went interrailing across Croatia and then to Germany, and I was in London shooting a show. And so one of the things that this last 3.5, 4 years gave me was that my kids weren't quite cooked, and I got to be part of the final bit of their baking, if in a way. And I really am grateful for that. I'm so grateful for that. And I guess I write about that in the book as well. I write about the way I had to find myself, in losing Jake as a partner. I also had to find myself again as a mother, I guess, and as a stay-at-home mum in many ways.
Well, thinking about your work, do you feel that this experience has now shifted what you're drawn to or the time you will spend on certain projects? I mean, I think it seems from the outside that you are highly specific about any work you will take on.
It's going through a change. I mean, I was actually going through a change just prior to this in terms of looking at my workload. Jake collapsed a few months before my 50th birthday, and I was really starting to examine how much I'd been taking on in terms of work and how much time I was away. And I think for me, like a lot of people, COVID and the pandemic hitting was also very interesting because it did make me kind of simplify my life. And I'm very intentional about what I do now. I think very carefully about what I want to do, not just about the subject matter, because that's always at its heart. That's always the thing that draws me. But I think about what kind of experience I want to have, often for 2, 3, 4 years longer. Being diagnosed with cancer and now 2 years clear, I never take those trips to the oncologist for granted. And so I work in much smaller blocks, and I try and think about what I can work on and what is going to be significant to me, but also what's going to be fun. I've worked with some brilliant directors and some brilliant producers, and I've been very, very genuinely lucky in my career, but nobody is immune to working with, can I use the word assholes? And no one is immune to working on projects that you may have done for the money and then you deeply regret. And I weed those out pretty quickly now, and I choose who I work with very carefully.
The book definitely, I feel, distills, for those of us who obviously haven't had your experience, that reminder to hold those people you love tight and to prioritize that over other things. It's a real recorrection, reading your book?
I think that's really interesting to use that word correction, actually. I love it because I would say that what's happened to us, whilst I wish it had never happened, and it's very strange that because I also see the huge gifts it's given me, but I still wish it had never happened. I still wish that Jacob and my children had not gone through, and myself to a certain had not gone through what we've gone through. But it has been the most extraordinary reset. And that's a reset around damage. I have been lucky because that idea that the book says, hold those you love close. I'm not just talking about anybody. I'm talking about the fact that I got to hold Jake close again. Because when you think that you're going to lose someone, the life of someone, I mean, it's still, I can feel my voice drop when I talk about it. And when your own life is in question, you hold on to that because it's the reminder that a reset's a good thing. And so we got lucky. Jacob has come through this and come through it more than we would ever have hoped for. Specifically in the last 6 months, he's made the most incredible recovery. Only last night I was with him and we walked down Marylebone High Street together. It's a very beautiful, very exclusive street in London. But at the weekend, we got to walk down Marylebone High Street, something we used to do as a kind of Saturday morning treat. And we'd stop and have our favourite coffee. And it was such a joy. And I couldn't believe I was with him doing this. And I kept on looking at him. And we went to our local butcher's there. And we didn't even buy anything. But the joy he took just looking at his favourite cheese shop and his favourite butcher's. We didn't buy a thing. But he hadn't been there for 4 years. It was like I was shaking again. I got that shaking feeling again. And I was like, this is pure joy that I get to do this because I didn't think I was going to get to do this again with him. And we were not an ideal marriage. You know, anyone knows us. We fought and we disliked each other. And there were times where it didn't look like we would survive. But the one thing is about Jacob is I really, really liked him. And I really, really like him. He's still my favourite person in the world. So I do say that with a privilege. And when I'm aware with the book, you know, I'm aware that I was with people who didn't survive. I saw people in the ward who didn't survive. I've had friends whose partners didn't survive. I feel gratitude I did, but I feel a huge sense of loss they didn't get to do that.
Yeah.
That makes
well, this
sense.
probably leads in to my last question because I have to let you go. What lights you up?
Hearing my daughter and Jacob laugh again together, because that's something that's been really hard to regain. It's been devastating for me, but I've written a book which has really helped me, and it's been devastating for Jacob, but he's slowly rebuilding. But for your children, you forget that this is a significant experience that shaped them, and what you hope is that they'll regain some of that which they lost. And so I heard my daughter and Jacob laughing downstairs yesterday, and I felt that lights me up. To see the most important thing was that Jake survived and Jake had a life. And that became bigger than me and him. It became about him and wanting him to have a life in the world. And so a joy for me is now to see Jake ride a bicycle. It's to see him telling me he's just been to his favourite deli. You know, it's to see the joy he feels about going to see a musical or singing along to a bit of Sondheim. Those are great joys, to see that all is not lost.
Abi, that's beautiful. And thank you so much for speaking to me about the book, but also for sharing this story.
Thanks so much. Really nice talking to you. Thanks.
Lit Up is a podcast from Sugar 23. It's hosted by me, Angela Ledgerwood, and is produced by Liam Billingham. Olivia Almer is the marketing and editorial consultant. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Andrei Radovsky wrote the theme music. See you in 2 weeks.